I have never used an Airbnb, and I never will. Don't get me wrong, I love to travel. I love to see new places in the world, when I can scrape together the funds and find the time, but I cannot, in good conscience, contribute to that company. If you've been following my writing, you know what I'm about to do. This is me spilling the tea on Airbnb. When Airbnb launched in 2008, it was largely marketed as a more affordable alternative to your large chain hotels like Marriott and Wyndham and Hilton. So it gave people a more affordable accommodation service as they went abroad. It was also a great way for people who already owned a home, who maybe just wanted to get away for the weekend or had a business trip and weren't using the residence anyway, to list that place on the website and just make a little bit of income on the side. Anybody operating a bed and breakfast were able to use Airbnb as a way to reach out to a larger customer base. Going back to the more affordable accommodation service, since many millennials fit that description of a cash-strapped traveler, it was very popular very quickly, with guest arrivals on a near doubling rate every year. With its surge in popularity, you can definitely make the argument that Airbnb did help out a lot of cities with their tourism, but there was already a sector for that. Unsurprisingly, Airbnb's first critic would be the hotel industry. Makes sense, a disruptor comes in, undercuts the price, and suddenly makes it a lot more difficult for hotels to attract customers. So a lot of hotel and lodging associations try to appeal to their local regulators to lessen the impact of short-term rentals. Airbnb definitely kicked off the whole short-term rental craze on a more, industrial scale. So everybody knew what the term short-term rental meant, not only just because it was self-evident in its definition, but it became a very regularly used service in travel. But as Airbnb grew in popularity, so too did its problems. All of a sudden, the critic base was growing faster and faster every day. And these critics were furious. When people saw the popularity of Airbnb, fewer people were actually interested in becoming longer-term landlords. They were interested in going straight to running their own micro-hotel. In Canada, the environment was quite ripe for this opportunity to expand a real estate portfolio to actually take on more Airbnb locations. So take your pick. It was low interest rates, it was the abuse of HELOCs, if somebody owned a primary residence, to actually use that as a down payment for multiple condos and other residences that they can use to list on Airbnb. So before you knew it, these people who had one property all of a sudden took up 2, 3, maybe even more condos for the sole purpose of listing them on the website and generating more income that would be more lucrative and more, instantaneous and reliable in some cases than having a tenant there that's only paying market prices. And this was very frustrating because this took units off of the market and, just made them into hotels because, we need more of those, right? So the amount of Airbnb listings actually blew up across the country. So Vancouver had just under 5,000, Toronto had well over 23,000 last time I checked, and Montreal actually had just over 19,000. Most of these properties that were listed on Airbnb were entire homes or apartments. So we're not just talking about a room in somebody's house to be used for weekends and maybe holidays. These were actually entire homes that were just ripped from the market supply and used for people traveling either internationally or from across the country. So unsurprisingly, taking these units off of the rental market eroded the rental supply, creating more supply and demand imbalances, and The sheer velocity of how people used low interest rates to buy more condos created more of a velocity in the the real estate market in this whole buy and sell frenzy. So that in itself would drive up real estate prices even further. So we're kind of getting hit on two ends there. I won't say that Airbnb was the sole contributor of the housing crisis that we see ourselves in, but it's definitely a factor. So eroding rental supply and actually creating more expensive housing is not helping anybody trying to enter into that market or just live in their city more affordably. And these are the macro issues I've just addressed. There's tons of micro issues that came about with Airbnb as well. For people who live in condos who bought the condo to actually live in it, all of a sudden their neighbor turns out is running an Airbnb unit. I've heard stories of people living in these condo spaces where there's just parties on weekdays for as late as 2 a.m. or even, just an all-nighter. And because these are tourists, they don't care. They're walking around in the hallways being very loud. And I think some of the worst I've heard was just how the public areas would have messes, and sometimes you would find just puddles of vomit across the hallways and the elevators. It just turned somebody's home into a frat house. And these were the more minor complaints, oddly enough. Some of them ranged to serious issues like the rate of human trafficking that happens in some short-term rentals. They do happen in hotels as well, which is something that we seriously need to crack down on, but with short-term rentals, there's less security there. These problems, both micro and macro, would have continued to keep compounding and becoming more acute and severe as the years wore on. Until this year, COVID-19 happened. COVID-19 ravaged the global travel industry, so all of a sudden these Airbnb hosts were just not getting any customers at all. So for hosts that were dependent on this income, all of a sudden their income just stopped on a dime. Worse still, Airbnb actually changed its policy regarding cancellations, so they waived cancellation fees because the crisis was deemed as unforeseen circumstances, and a lot of hosts weren't actually able to reclaim those fees. For the casual hosts that rented out their primary residence on weekends and during business trips, this wasn't much of an issue. For people who actually ran a legitimate B&B service, this was a significant hit to their independent business. And for people who overextended themselves and had multiple condos and multiple mortgages to pay and counted their whole business plan just relied on that constant flux of income, this was a nightmare. This situation was so dire for the hosts that the Airbnb company actually tried to appeal to the Canadian federal government to actually provide some sort of bailout plan for the hosts. So this would include tax breaks or credits or some sort of local regulation that would help give more money to Airbnb hosts that were suddenly suffering at the hands of COVID-19. Unsurprisingly, Canada wasn't having it. The company, whose business model very arguably made it harder for Canadians to live in their hometowns and made them dig deep into their pockets to be able to make rent every month, was suddenly asking them to dig even deeper to help bail out these hosts and help them maintain an income on their investments. This is beyond frustrating for a variety of reasons. First off, these investors that were making a lot of money off of these micro hotels were constantly running this narrative that people weren't entitled to affordable housing, particularly millennials. They were always telling them to roll up their sleeves and get to work, and maybe they would be able to afford to live in their hometowns. These people who feel that people weren't entitled to housing suddenly feel entitled to make an income off their investments. I wrote about this recently, very distinctly saying that you are not entitled to make a return on your investment. I even repeated, you are not entitled to make a return on your investment. I want to add that you are not entitled to make a return on your investment at the expense of another person's quality of life. All these investors appeared to be an everyman for themselves kind of free marketer when times were good. As soon as they saw their investments drop, they changed their tune very quickly and went to the same public federal aid trough that everybody else needed. I wouldn't be so frustrated with their need for relief benefits, that they are entitled to the same relief benefits that everybody else enjoys, but these were probably the same people who were so proud of their smart investment and constantly stood in the way of these regulations that would curb these short-term rentals and make housing more affordable and fair for everybody else trying to participate in the market, not as an investor, but as somebody who is just looking for a place to live. They seem to think that everybody should work doubly hard to pay their own way. But when it's them that's suddenly having a little bit of issues, everybody should rush to their help only. You can read more about this rant on my website, stephaniehughesjournalism.com. I kind of go into detail about my grievances with its impact on particularly Toronto's rental market, because I've been trying to get into the market myself. And I just kind of lay it flat about why I have issues with these hosts. The response to the article has largely been in agreement with me, saying that these hosts really don't deserve a dime, especially as many of them were operating illegally to begin with. And some of these responses on Twitter, they were just... couldn't have asked for a better group of delightful smartasses. And of course, an article like this does come with hate mail, particularly with hosts. So one host said that I just haven't earned the right to live in my own hometown because I haven't worked hard enough. Forget that I have worked multiple jobs over the course of, since I graduated high school, really. And just anytime I aggressively saved and thought I had enough to enter into the market, it just swept away again because of these really aggressive investment practices. I was also accused of being a communist. I don't get it either. If there's any silver lining to this COVID crisis at all, it would be that companies like Airbnb and other short-term rentals that do more harm than good, in my opinion, will just collapse. But it's also been pointed out to me by a few people that even if Airbnb fell and all the other short-term rental companies just collapsed under the weight of this crisis, the model has been pretty effective, and there will probably just be another company that will swiftly take its place. To be clear, I would never celebrate the loss of income that anybody experienced during COVID-19. And I acknowledge that there have been so many people on Airbnb that actually use the site legitimately and don't deserve any of the grief that befalls them here. But I'm drawing the line when you ask taxpayers to help cover the losses of your irresponsible investments. A lot of these taxpayers are already hurting from high costs of living that you helped contribute to. And if you're one of these Airbnb investors that's just frothing at the mouth right now because I'm some entitled millennial that's telling you that you're not entitled to return on your investment, the taxpayers you hurt with your business model don't owe you a return on your investment. Period.